The blast did not just shatter the heavy timber doors of the railway mail car, it vaporized them. Deep within the suffocating darkness of Tunnel 13, carved through the unforgiving granite of the Siskiyou Mountains in southern Oregon, the shockwave had nowhere to go but straight down the tracks. It rolled through the rock like a physical wall of force, blowing out the lanterns of the Southern Pacific passenger train and plunging hundreds of terrified passengers into total darkness. Choking black smoke, laced with the bitter chemical stench of vaporized dynamite and pulverized coal, instantly filled the narrow mountain bore. At the front of the train, pinned beneath the crushing weight of shattered steel and splintered pine, federal mail clerk Elvin Dougherty was already dead, incinerated in a fraction of a second. Outside the smoking wreckage, 3 young men stood in the freezing mountain air, their ears ringing, their clothes covered in soot, and their hands trembling as they gripped their heavy caliber revolvers. They had just triggered the deadliest, most catastrophic train robbery of the 20th century. But as the smoke began to clear, revealing the mangled, burning husk of car number 13, the devastating reality of their miscalculation set in. There would be no gold. There would be no glory. There would only be blood, a blazing inferno and the dawn of the most relentless, scientifically advanced manhunt the United States had ever seen. The year was 1923, and the golden age of the American train robber was supposed to be long dead. The romanticized era of masked men galloping alongside wooden passenger cars, waving six-shooters and demanding pocket watches, had been thoroughly crushed by the turn of the century. The relentless expansion of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, the invention of the telegraph, and the sheer industrial might of the federal government had turned train robbery from a daring frontier enterprise into a guaranteed suicide mission. By the dawn of the Roaring Twenties, America was rapidly modernizing. Cities were being electrified, commercial radio was taking flight, and automobiles were rolling off assembly lines by the millions. Yet, nestled in the rugged, isolated timberlands of the Pacific Northwest, the violent spirit of the old frontier refused to die quietly. If you find yourself fascinated by these dark, forgotten chapters of American history, where the romantic myths of the Wild West collide with the gritty, unforgiving reality of the industrial age, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Hitting that button helps me keep digging into the archives to bring you these incredible, untold stories of true crime and impossible engineering. Now, to understand why a catastrophic train robbery happened in a modernizing 1923 America, we have to look at the irresistible temptation rolling along the tracks of the Southern Pacific Railroad. The railway connecting Portland, Oregon to San Francisco, California, was a vital commercial artery. It did not just carry passengers. It carried the lifeblood of the Western economy: cash, bank transfers, negotiable bonds, and gold. The federal government relied heavily on the railway mail service to physically transport vast sums of money between regional Federal Reserve branches. The railway mail cars were essentially rolling bank vaults. They were heavily armored, locked from the inside, and staffed by armed federal postal clerks who were ordered to defend the mail with their lives. This was not a secret. Everyone in the logging camps, the mining towns, and the railroad yards whispered about the massive shipments of wealth passing through their backyards in the dead of night. Among those listening to these whispers were 3 brothers working in the lumber camps of Oregon: Ray, Roy, and Hugh DeAutremont. Ray and Roy were twins, 23 years old, and their younger brother Hugh was just 19. They were not hardened outlaws, nor were they brilliant criminal masterminds. They were restless, dissatisfied, and deeply radicalized by the socialist literature floating around the Pacific Northwest timber camps. The DeAutremont brothers despised the grueling, bone-crushing labor of the logging industry. They worked long hours in freezing rain, swinging axes and pulling massive cross-cut saws for pennies, while they watched corporate railroad barons haul millions of dollars through the very mountains they were breaking their backs to clear. They convinced themselves that the system was hopelessly rigged, and they decided to take their share by force. They wanted to fund a utopian life, perhaps a revolution, or perhaps just a comfortable retirement in a foreign country. To do that, they needed capital. And they believed that $500,000 in gold coin was scheduled to travel south on Southern Pacific Train number 13, the legendary Gold Special. The plan they devised was terrifyingly simple, born from a toxic mix of frontier mythology and industrial era explosives. They would not chase the train on horseback. They would use the brutal geography of the Siskiyou Mountains against the Southern Pacific Railroad. The rail line climbing the Siskiyou Pass was an engineering nightmare. To cross the rugged mountain range, the tracks had to ascend a punishing, twisting grade. Steam locomotives, despite their massive power, struggled desperately against the laws of physics on these inclines. They burned through tons of coal and thousands of gallons of water, their iron drive wheels slipping and grinding against the steel rails as they fought gravity. To make it over the summit, heavy passenger and freight trains required an intricate system of helper engines and agonizingly slow speeds. Right at the apex of this grueling climb sat Tunnel 13. It was a narrow, soot-stained bore carved through solid granite, stretching for over 3,000 feet in total darkness. Because of the steep grade, any train entering the tunnel from the north would be crawling at a barely sustainable 8 to 10 miles per hour. The brothers realized that Tunnel 13 was the perfect choke point. The train would be moving slow enough to board. The darkness of the tunnel would hide their movements, and the isolation of the summit meant that law enforcement was hours away. The brothers spent months meticulously preparing. They stockpiled weapons, including a pump-action shotgun and heavy revolvers. They packed food and camping supplies to survive in the wilderness during their escape. And crucially, they stole a massive quantity of blasting gelatin from a nearby construction site. Blasting gelatin is an extremely potent industrial explosive, far more volatile and powerful than standard dynamite. It was designed to shatter solid granite, to blow massive tree stumps out of the earth, and to carve highways through mountainsides. The DeAutremont brothers planned to use it to blow the reinforced door off the railway mail car. October 11th, 1923. The sky over the Siskiyou Mountains was heavy and gray, and a biting chill hung in the autumn air. Southern Pacific train. Number 13, a heavy passenger train pulled by a massive steam locomotive, was laboring up the mountain grade. In the cab of the locomotive, engineer Sidney Bates and fireman Marvin Seng were engaged in the exhausting, physically punishing work of keeping the massive machine alive. Seng was shoveling coal into the roaring firebox at a frantic pace, fighting the brutal heat, while Bates expertly manipulated the throttle and air brakes, listening to the agonizing groans of the boiler as it strained against the mountain. Right behind the massive locomotive was the railway mail car. Inside this swaying, violently vibrating steel and wood box, mail clerk Elvin Duggarty was working under the dim glow of electric lamps. The floor of the car was piled high with canvas sacks. He was armed, locked in, and completely unaware that 3 armed men were hiding in the brush near the northern portal of Tunnel 13. As the locomotive crested the grade and plunged into the pitch-black maw of the tunnel, the temperature dropped, and the air immediately filled with choking black smoke. The train was moving at a crawling pace. Suddenly, 2 figures emerged from the shadows. Ray and Roy DeAutremont swung themselves onto the moving locomotive, scrambling over the tender and dropping directly into the cab. They leveled a shotgun and a revolver at Bates and Seng. Over the deafening roar of the steam engine and the echoing thunder of the exhaust bouncing off the tunnel walls, they screamed their orders. Stop the train. Engineer Sidney Bates, staring down the barrel of a loaded shotgun, did what he was told. He closed the throttle and engaged the heavy air brakes. The massive train shrieked and groaned as thousands of tons of steel ground to a halt inside the suffocating darkness of Tunnel 13. The locomotive and the mail car were stopped just inside the southern portal, while the passenger coaches stretched far back into the pitch-black tunnel. Now came the critical phase of the heist. The younger brother, Hugh, rushed forward with a heavy canvas sack. Inside the sack was the blasting gelatin. The brothers ordered the engineer and the fireman out of the cab and onto the ballast alongside the tracks. They marched them toward the locked mail car. Ray DeAutremont pounded on the reinforced door, screaming at Elvin Doherty to open up. Inside, Doherty did exactly what his federal training dictated. He stayed silent, kept the door locked, and likely drew his weapon, preparing for a siege. The brothers were out of time. The longer the train sat in the tunnel, the greater the risk that a passenger or a conductor would realize what was happening and launch a counterattack. It was time to use the explosives. Ray DeAutremont rigged the blasting gelatin against the heavy side door of the mail car. He attached a detonator and a short fuse. The brothers, holding their hostages at gunpoint, retreated a short distance down the tracks and took cover in the brush. Then the 7-minute pivot arrived. The moment where history fractures, where meticulous planning collides with catastrophic ignorance. The DeAutremont brothers had spent months stealing guns, scouting locations, and mapping their escape route, but they had fundamentally misunderstood the science of explosives. They did not just use a little dynamite to pop a lock or blow a hinge. In their paranoia and greed, they had wired a massive charge, enough blasting gelatin to level a small commercial building. And they had placed this massive charge against a heavy train car which was tightly wedged inside a narrow tunnel carved through solid mountain rock. The physics were apocalyptic. Before we look at the devastating aftermath of this explosion, I have a question for you. When you hear about these historical train robberies, do you think the outlaws actually believed they could retire peacefully with the money? Or do you think they were driven entirely by the adrenaline and the myth of the outlaw lifestyle? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, because the DeAutremont brothers' motivations seem completely divorced from reality. When the fuse hit the detonator, the explosion defied description. The sheer concussive force of the blasting gelatin had nowhere to expand outward. The granite walls of the tunnel acted like the barrel of a massive cannon, directing the entire fury of the blast straight into the mail car and down the length of the train. The sound was deafening, a catastrophic boom that cracked the eardrums of the passengers sitting hundreds of feet away. The massive steel and wood mail car was instantly obliterated. The heavy roof was blown entirely off its frame. The reinforced walls shattered into a million lethal splinters that tore through the tunnel like shrapnel. A shockwave of fire and overpressure swept through the wreckage. When the dust and smoke began to settle, the DeAutremont brothers emerged from the brush, expecting to see a breached vault and a pile of canvas sacks filled with gold coin. Instead, they walked into an absolute nightmare. The mail car was gone. In its place was a tangled, burning ruin of jagged steel and flaming pine. The blast had been so ferocious that it ignited the mail sacks, the wooden debris, and the coal dust in the air. The front of the train was now a roaring inferno, filling the tunnel with deadly, suffocating smoke. Inside the wreckage, Federal Mail Clerk Elvin Dougherty was dead. He had been instantly killed by the colossal overpressure and the flying shrapnel. The brothers frantically searched the burning debris, desperately looking for the $500,000 in gold they had risked their lives for. But the fire was too hot, the smoke was too thick, and the wreckage was impenetrable. There was no gold to be found. In their sheer incompetence, they had likely vaporized the very vault they were trying to open, or it was buried beneath tons of flaming iron. Panic set in. The perfect heist had dissolved into a flaming, blood-soaked disaster. The brothers realized that they had committed federal murder. They had destroyed a United States mail train, and they had exactly $0 to show for it. Through the dense, choking smoke rolling out of the tunnel, they saw a figure moving toward them. It was Cloyd Bates, the brakeman of the train, who had walked forward from the passenger cars to investigate the explosion. The brothers, fueled by adrenaline, terror, and a sudden violent realization that they had to eliminate all witnesses, opened fire. They shot brakeman Cloyd Bates down in cold blood. Then, turning their weapons on their hostages, they executed engineer Sidney Bates and fireman Marvin Singh right there in the gravel. 4 innocent railroad men who worked grueling, dangerous jobs just to feed their families, lay dead in the soot and the smoke of Tunnel 13. The DeAutremont brothers turned and fled into the rugged timberlands of the Siskiyou Mountains, leaving behind a blazing train, screaming passengers, and a crime scene that would soon shock the entire nation. The news of the massacre at Tunnel 13 hit the American public like a shockwave. This was 1923. Train robberies were supposed to be extinct, relics of the Jesse James era. To have a heavily armed gang hijack a passenger train, blow a federal mail car to splinters with industrial explosives, and execute 4 unarmed men in cold blood was an outrage that demanded an immediate, overwhelming response. The Southern Pacific Railroad, the United States Post Office Department, and the federal government unleashed a manhunt of unprecedented scale. The legendary Pinkerton National Detective Agency was brought in, deploying their top agents to scour the mountains. Local sheriffs, state police, and armed posses, formed by angry citizens, flooded the forests of southern Oregon. Even the United States military contributed, sending airplanes from nearby airfields to conduct aerial searches of the rugged wilderness, a tactic that was incredibly rare for law enforcement in the early 1920s. But despite the massive dragnet, the DeAutremont brothers had seemingly vanished into thin air. They knew the deep timberlands, they had stockpiled supplies, and they managed to slip through the closing noose of the posses. For a brief moment, it looked as though the murderers might actually get away with the most horrific train heist in modern history. But the investigators had a secret weapon, one that the DeAutremont brothers, with their frontier outlaw mindset, could never have anticipated. The detectives possessed the crushing power of modern forensic science. While the heavily armed posses were thrashing blindly through the mountain brush, postal inspectors were meticulously combing through the blast zone at Tunnel 13. Near the site, where the brothers had hidden before the hijacking, an investigator found a discarded pair of heavy canvas bib overalls. In the pocket of those overalls was a piece of folded paper, heavily stained with grease and dirt. It appeared to be a registered mail receipt. Beside the overalls, investigators found a discarded pistol and a knapsack. In the old days of the Wild West, a generic pair of overalls and an unreadable receipt would have been useless. A sheriff might have held them up, shrugged, and thrown them in a box. But in 1923, law enforcement was evolving. The postal inspectors boxed up the overalls, the receipt, and the knapsack, and they shipped them on a train down to Berkeley, California. They were sending the evidence to a man named Edward Oscar Heinrich. Heinrich was a brilliant chemist, a pharmacist, and a pioneer in the emerging field of criminalistics. The press would later dub him the Edison of crime. He possessed an obsessive attention to detail, a towering intellect, and a fully equipped forensic laboratory. When he received the box of evidence from Tunnel 13, he did not just look at the overalls. He placed them under a high-powered microscope. What Heinrich discovered in his laboratory in Berkeley is a masterclass in the gritty, painstaking reality of modern investigation. Through microscopic analysis, Heinrich found tiny, almost invisible chips of wood clinging to the fabric of the overalls. He analyzed the cellular structure of the wood chips and determined they were Douglas fir. He found microscopic traces of pitch and sap, specifically native to the lumber camps of the Pacific Northwest. But Heinrich went deeper. Deep inside the tiny, reinforced watch pocket of the overalls, he found a single, microscopic fingernail clipping. Under the microscope, he observed that the clipping was uncharacteristically thick and clean, indicating it belonged to a man who engaged in heavy manual labor but kept his hands relatively clean, like a left-handed lumberjack who was fastidious about his appearance. He then turned his attention to the grease-stained, illegible receipt. Heinrich used chemical solutions and early forms of ultraviolet light analysis to carefully dissolve the grease and lift the faded ink. Slowly, letters and numbers began to emerge from the stained paper. The document was revealed to be a registered mail receipt, stamped in Eugene, Oregon, issued to a man named Roy DeAutremont. Heinrich sent a telegraph back to the federal authorities in Oregon. He did not just give them a name, he gave them a devastatingly accurate physical profile. He told them they were looking for a left-handed lumberjack who worked in the Douglas fir camps, who was between the ages of 20 and 25, and who likely had 2 accomplices. The investigators immediately zeroed in on Eugene, Oregon. They questioned locals and family members and quickly established that Roy DeAutremont and his 2 brothers, Ray and Hugh, had mysteriously vanished on the very day of the train robbery. The mystery of who committed the massacre at Tunnel 13 was solved, but the manhunt was just beginning. What followed was the most extensive, relentless public awareness campaign in the history of global law enforcement. The Postal Service, the Pinkertons, and the Southern Pacific Railroad joined forces to print wanted posters. They did not just print a few thousand, they printed over 2 million wanted posters. These posters featured clear photographs of the 3 brothers, detailed physical descriptions, and a staggering reward of $15,900, a fortune in 1923. The logistics of this manhunt were staggering. The posters were distributed to every single post office, police station, and railway depot in the United States. But they did not stop there. The posters were translated into multiple languages and shipped internationally. They were sent to police departments in Europe, South America, and Asia. They were handed out to ship captains, border guards, and foreign embassies. The faces of the DeAutremont brothers were plastered across the entire globe. For over 3 long years, the brothers lived on the run, operating under assumed names, constantly looking over their shoulders, terrified of every police officer and every passing stranger. The pressure was immense. They had planned for a romanticized outlaw escape, but the gritty reality was a paranoid, miserable existence of hiding in cheap boarding houses and taking backbreaking labor jobs just to eat. The relentless, grinding machinery of the federal manhunt finally caught up with the DeAutremont brothers in 1927, nearly 4 years after the massacre, and it was the sheer saturation of those 2 million wanted posters that brought them down. The youngest brother, Hugh, had changed his name, enlisted in the United States military, and was stationed thousands of miles away in the Philippines. He thought he was completely safe, hidden among thousands of enlisted men on an isolated Pacific island. But a fellow soldier, a sergeant who had spent hours staring at the wanted posters pinned to the bulletin boards back in the States, recognized Hugh's face. The sergeant reported him, and federal authorities quietly surrounded Hugh in the barracks and placed him in irons. Back in the United States, the massive publicity surrounding Hughes' arrest triggered the final collapse of the gang. A man in Ohio, reading a newspaper article about the capture in the Philippines, realized that the descriptions of the two older brothers matched two men who were living quietly in his town under the names of Elmer and Clarence. The federal agents and local authorities swooped in, arresting Ray and Roy DeAutremont without a single shot being fired. The last great train robbers of the American West did not go down in a blaze of glory. They did not have a cinematic shootout with federal agents on a mountain ridge. They surrendered quietly, exhausted, broken, and terrified. Miles away from the mountains they had stained with blood. They were transported back to Oregon, facing a public that was baying for their execution. The evidence against them, spearheaded by the brilliant forensic work of Edward Oscar Heinrich, was utterly insurmountable. Realizing they had no chance of fighting the charges, the brothers eventually confessed to the hijacking, the explosion, and the murders. They were each sentenced to life in prison, avoiding the hangman's noose, but permanently losing their freedom. The legacy of the Tunnel 13 train robbery is a profound and dark pivot point in American history. It stands as the violent, ugly death rattle of the Wild West. The DeAutremont brothers were driven by the impossible motivation of achieving the romanticized outlaw lifestyle in a world that had already moved on. They thought they were the heirs to Jesse James, but their utter lack of understanding regarding modern explosives and industrial reality led to the pointless slaughter of 4 innocent men. Furthermore, the case marked a monumental shift in the history of criminal investigation. The brilliant work of Edward Oscar Heinrich proved to the world that the era of relying solely on tracking footprints in the dirt was over. The microscope, chemistry, and meticulous forensic analysis had arrived, proving that science could track a killer across thousands of miles based on a single splinter of wood and a faded laundry receipt. The Southern Pacific Railroad eventually repaired the tracks at the summit of the Siskiyou Mountains. Steam trains continued to haul passengers and gold through the pitch-black darkness of Tunnel 13 for decades to come. But the railwaymen who operated those trains, the firemen shoveling coal, and the engineers riding the brakes never forgot what happened in the freezing autumn of 1923. They never forgot the brutal reality that a romanticized myth of outlaw glory was paid for with the blood of working men. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the tragic and fascinating history of car number 13 and the birth of modern forensic manhunts. If you appreciated this level of detail and want to keep exploring the dark, mechanical history of the railroads and the true crimes of the era, please hit the like button, subscribe, and leave a comment with which historical event I should investigate next. Your support is exactly what allows me to keep unearthing these incredible stories. Until next time, keep looking past the myths, and I will see you in the next analysis.